So we come now to the sixth trumpet judgment, and remember that there are three sets of seven judgments: the seven seal judgments, the seven trumpet judgments, and the seven bowl judgments. Seventh seal is the seven trumpets, seventh trumpet is the seven bowls, and the seventh bowl is the second coming. If you get that part, it helps to keep them straight. By this time, things are happening probably pretty quickly, and there may be some overlap in some of the information. We'll see that in a little bit, but they are distinct. And remember that the first four trumpets that we saw all bring some sort of judgment to the earth, just like the first four seal judgments did. It was the fifth seal judgment that brought us before the altar of God. The sixth seal judgment brought this judgment on the earth and the sun and the moon. And the same is with the seven trumpets. The first four trumpets focus on God's judgment of the earth, but the last two judgments, that's trumpet number 5 and trumpet number 6, takes us to the pit of hell itself and talks about this demonic army that's going to be invading the earth. Sounds like stuff right out of science fiction, but it is real. And so remember that as we look at these judgments, that there's two things that are happening. There is judgment on the earth, but it's originating from heaven. But there's also judgment taking place in heaven because of the rebellion. Satan's rebellion took place in heaven, spilled over onto earth. So that's an important thing to remember. And it was probably foreshadowed in Exodus 12:12, when God talks about him bringing judgment on Pharaoh and on the Egyptians because they held his people in slavery. But simultaneously, he was exercising judgment on the gods of Egypt, or the demons behind them. So we come to the sixth of the seven trumpets. And then, as John had done with the seal judgments, he took a pause before getting into the seven trumpets. He's going to do that again here too. We're going to cover the sixth trumpet, and then there'll be a pause before he gets into the seventh trumpet, which, again, is the seven bowls. So, Revelation chapter 9, we're still in chapter 9, picking it up in verse 13. The sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, "Release the four angels who were bound at the great river Euphrates." So the four angels who had been prepared for this hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of mounted troops was twice times 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number. Now I'm going to stop at verse 16 for now. That, by the way, is 200 million. That's where we hear about the 200 million man army. But there's time to get into that in a second. Let's go back and just pick apart the text and see what's happening. Remember, this judgment, like the fifth trumpet, goes to the very gates of hell and releases a demonic army on planet Earth. Now, probably through humans as well, but it's definitely a demonic army. Trumpet number 5, this one, trumpet number 6, and the next one, trumpet number 7, are also called the three woes. So this is the second of the three woes. Got all the terminology straight? But let's look what happens. So when the sixth angel blows his trumpet, John hears this voice from the four horns of the golden altar. Now, we need to understand, in the temple, which this is, the temple on earth is patterned after the temple in heaven. We see that, particularly in the book of Hebrews. This is a pattern, a foreshadow of what is there. So we're looking at the heavenly temple at this point. On the earthly temple, Solomon's temple, there were two altars. The one in the main outer court was the altar in which the daily sacrifices took place. But then as you get closer to the Holy of Holies, there is a smaller altar, a cubit by a cubit. I know, you know what a cubit is. And just say about a yard by yard. It's a small altar. And this particular altar was covered in gold. And on this altar, Aaron and the priests would offer this incredibly good smelling, sweet savor incense before God. It comes to represent the prayers of the saints. And we've seen that already in previous chapters, in like chapter 6, where we see the souls of the tribulation martyrs are before the throne of God, and they're crying out, "How long, O Lord?" Now, there is once a year that it was splattered with blood. That was on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But primarily, this smaller altar, right outside the presence of God, right outside of the throne of God, would be for the incense. So the reason why I say all that, if you look at the imagery, John says, "I heard a voice." Now, the voice could come from God. It could come from an angel. But we've already seen in chapter 6 that those tribulation martyrs are actually talking to God from before the altar, because they're saying, "How long before you exercise judgment?" God tells them they have to wait for a while. So this is a familiar scene if you're familiar with the temple. It's just this one's taking place in heaven. So the four horns of the golden altar, he hears his voice, and it says to the sixth angel. Now, the fact that it's giving the sixth angel a command, I'm guessing the voice is probably God, but we have to keep the options open. It says to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." Now, most of the time, people interpret those four angels that are bound as very powerful demons. Now, there's two primary reasons for that. Number one is they're bound. Number two, when they're released, they do a lot of killing. It is possible, however, that these are not bound in the sense of they're evil and they're just chomping at the bit to get loose. They could be restricted for this time of judgment. It doesn't really matter if we know that for sure. I think it's probably demonic angels, demons, powerful demons, but it's not the point of the text. The point of the text is what they do and where they are. So let's talk about the river Euphrates, for example. The river Euphrates is the eastern border of the land that's promised to Abraham by covenant with God. God gave a covenant to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, and we see there in Genesis 15, verse 18, that the borders of the promised land would go from the river of Egypt. Now, that's the Wadi El Arish in the middle of Sinai. It's not the Nile. So from the river of Egypt in the west to the east, which is the great river Euphrates. The northern and southern borders were not as specifically delineated, just big, but the river Euphrates is the end of Israel's territory. Now think about that. It's sort of like the end of the promised land. It would almost be like coming to the end of the Garden of Eden, and then there's wilderness or danger beyond. That's exactly how the mindset in the ancient Israel would have looked at the Euphrates, because from the other side of the Euphrates come the attacking hordes, the attacking armies. The Assyrians, for example, came from the other side of the Euphrates, and they came and they took the northern tribes captive and beat up some of the southern tribe of Judah. So these are invading, terrorizing armies that come from beyond the promised land. It's like the wilderness is sort of creeping into God's land. The Babylonians, the Euphrates River ran through Babylon. That's the river that runs through the city of Babylon. That's the river that Cyrus dried up so he could attack and defeat the city of Babylon in one day. The Babylonians are the stand-in for Satan's kingdom, and we'll see that later on in Revelation 17, 18. So, you know, beyond the Euphrates is bad stuff, bad demons, bad people. The Romans would also fear the Parthians, who would come from beyond the Euphrates River. So it's got this biblical and historical connotation of being really bad stuff happens from the other side of the Euphrates. Now, when we get to Revelation chapter 16, on the bowl judgments, interestingly, the sixth bowl judgment, the angel pours out the bowl and the great Euphrates dries up. And that makes the way for this 200 million man army to come from the kings, plural, of the east. It's how some Bible scholars have come to the conclusion that there will be a 200 million man army coming from the east that goes across the river Euphrates to march on Jerusalem. That could be. I grew up hearing that interpretation. 200 million is a lot. And the actual phraseology doesn't necessarily mean we have to count out 200 million, like 199,990,000. It's not like that. Could be. But more likely, it's an immeasurable number. As the late Carl Sagan would have said, billions and billions. There's a lot of people, not billions, but there's a 200 million man army is huge. And here's where they play geopolitical prophecy, and it's like, oh, it must come from China. No, it must not come from China. It might, but it also says the kings of the East. That's plural, kings. So we got to, again, be really careful who we're pointing the finger at whatever particular period of history to say they are the geopolitical bad guys. The point is very clear, however. The bad guys, the bad demons, and the invading armies usually come from the other side of the Promised Land, which is bounded by the river Euphrates. And here there are 4 very powerful demons who go to action. Now, how they kill is really going to be important. Let me read a little more of the text, and then we'll get into that. So the 4 angels who had been prepared for this hour, day, month, and year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Notice it's 1/3. When we had the seal judgments, one of the seals killed 1/4 of mankind. I would say, okay, 1/4 of mankind is dead. This is another 1/3 of the remaining. That's probably the easiest way to interpret that. That's a lot of people. And so, well, however many the population is left at that point, 1/3 of them are going to die. And how they die is what's going to become interesting. So the 4 angels have been prepared for this hour, day, month, and year, were released to kill 1/3 of mankind, and then it says that their number is basically 200 million. And then, verse 17, John says, and this is how I saw the horses in my vision. Now, these are horses, not locusts like we had seen before. These are horses that he sees in his vision, and those who rode them. Now, this is a demonic army. Be very, very careful about all of those prophecy enthusiasts who try to make this some sort of military equipment. And every time we upgrade our military, it seems like there's a new stand-in for what these things are. It used to be helicopters, and then they were, Star Wars lasers and all this kind of stuff. These are demons. Remember, the pit of hell has been opened. That's a really important point, because the veil between heaven and earth is now rent. I'm convinced that the people on the planet will recognize that we have indeed been invaded by aliens. They're called demons, and they're at war with us, and they're on these horses. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they are real horses. Again, this is prophetic literature, but they could look like horses, but they are actually traveling. And so we have to leave it at that. But he saw these horses in his vision. It's the only time that John actually uses the word vision. And I'm glad he uses it there, because that's a key to us to say, well, okay, we got horses, but we don't really necessarily have horses. That's 200 million horses. That's a lot of horses. But it is an army. It's a demonic army. I saw the horses in my vision, and they rode them. The demons rode them, or the demonic army rode them. If this is coming from humans, they're demonized. But you can't miss the demonic element here. They wore breastplates the color of fire and sapphire and of sulfur. So now, do they all have fire? Sapphire, fire, which is, yellow, orange, and sapphire, which is blue, and sulfur, burning yellow. Or are they sort of sprinkled throughout? What's interesting is these 3 colors are going to match the actual plagues that kill. And the heads of the horses were like lions' heads. The fire and the smoke and the sulfur came out of their mouths. By these 3 plagues, 1/3 of mankind was killed by fire, smoke, and sulfur coming out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents with heads, and by means of them they wound. Now, again, it's interesting. It's the horses that are killing. That's kind of bizarre. It's not the riders of the horses. What does that mean? Got good news. I don't know. Neither does anybody else. I'm going to be one of the rare times when I'll step out on a limb and make a guess. There's 2 elements to this demonic army. There's these really weird-looking horses that are actually doing the killing. And then there's these riders of the horses. And it's the horses that are killing. And I'm wondering if the horses aren't the demons themselves, and the riders may be the human army that the demonic forces are using to kill. That's a guess, but I wouldn't worry about that. The fact that they're killing 1/3 of mankind is important. And the fact that they have tails like serpents with heads is also important. To understand why, you have to keep watching. And we'll go right there.